Park launches this community. Yes, so the recording is now we are on recording. So yeah, welcome to this webinar on climate change. It's a Park Launch webinar. And I think the greatest thing which Park Launch does, this community founded by Ali Fahad, is that it connects us to brilliant Pakistanis who make us proud and who are global leaders in their areas. And we get to benefit from their experience and expertise. And also we get to get them to focus on things about Pakistan, which, they might not be doing. So, it connects us with them and it connects them to issues related to Pakistan. So before I kick off, I just wanted to thank Ali Fahad for arranging this and creating this community. And one such person, a global expert, is the speaker tonight, Dr. Salman Ahmed. He's the head of macro investments at Fidelity Investment. Just to put that in perspective, Fidelity manages more than $4.5 trillion of capital. So, that's almost like 4.5 times more than what IMF has, and, multiple times more than what World Bank has. So that shows you the kind of influence which Dr. Salman has. And of course, he's well quoted, always quoted in global press, and he's a regular speaker on CNBC, Bloomberg. And so, it's a pleasure that he gives time to talk to us about issues related to Pakistan. Before Fidelity, he was the CIO of Lombard Odier, a Swiss private bank. And before that, he has been an economist at Goldman Sachs. And he has worked on, reports and work. He did some body of work which has been very important for frontier markets. He was a part of the team which coined the term N11, which included Pakistan in it. He's a graduate of LOIM, and he also was a gold medalist in his class. So Dr. Salman, as always, a pleasure to have you. And I know you have done a lot of work on climate change. You published a white paper. It's on Fidelity's website. Over to you. Would love to hear from you. What does climate change mean for Pakistan, and especially from its impact on investment and the financial markets and the outlook for Pakistan? So over to you.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you for that very generous welcome. Thank you very much, and thank you to Ali for setting us up and connecting us. As you said, it's it really multiplies the effort, and secondly also allows a platform to connect on focus areas which obviously affect Pakistan, as you rightly pointed out. So it's a pleasure and it's a privilege to be able to speak to you and engage and share thoughts on the topic of climate change itself. In the financial industry over the last at least 7-8 years, the focus on climate change has increased exponentially. It's mainly been driven by the client base, whereby people have been, and investors have been asking in terms of what impact their investments are having, and then also as recognition and acknowledgement of human activities' role in climate change has increased and has penetrated public consciousness, especially in the developed world. That has translated into areas where financial system and financial participants are very keenly focused on this issue. A lot of development has happened in terms of understanding this just challenge, connecting investments to tangible outcomes, and at a very minimum, understanding what kind of carbon emissions investment portfolios are emitting, if you will, depending on the companies you are invested in. In Europe, the regulatory framework has also come in a big way to create more transparency when it comes to sources of climate change, and the critical one being carbon emissions. So this is the context of how we were doing the work, and then some of the papers you mentioned we published. So they take so initially when the focus started, it was quite weak in the sense that in terms of its impact and outcomes, because there was not a lot of data around. So the first few years, a lot of focus was on gathering data. A lot of new providers came through, which gave a very good sense of what the emissions are: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which is direct emissions, indirect through the supply chains, and then thirdly in terms of users of your products and services as well. And now they are being wired into the regulatory setups, especially in Europe. But the work we have done is it takes a very top-down and long-term view on climate change. What we tried to do was take what the current understanding of climate change is and then map it into variables which make sense to us as investors or long-term investors. So what we found was, and these efforts we started 2.5 years ago. So we have been publishing a number of papers along the during this period. So 2 are already out, 2 are under construction, which will be released in the next few months. So what we found was that if you look at the current understanding of climate change, first point which comes out is this is a very geographical phenomenon. Not everybody is exposed to climate change equally. Second was that if you look at, for example, the work done by IPCC, which coordinates all the different strands which are coming through, because it's a very complex topic, it affects everything in terms of how the entire economic system and as a result the financial system is wired and designed. The second point which came through was that the confidence of climate scientists in the idea that human-driven or human-caused emissions are the main driver of increase in temperatures has increased quite significantly. So there's a lot of work which has done to show the connection between carbon emissions specifically and more generally GHG emissions in terms of temperature pathways which lies ahead. So what we did was we took all these models as a given, and then we basically looked at a number of damage functions. What a damage function does is that it takes temperature pathways as an input variable and then spits out economic damages as a result of physical risk of climate change, which is that if warming happens, then what is the GDP impact based on number of modeling parameters. The 2 key drivers, this is again a very complex topic, but I'll try to simplify, but the 2 key drivers are productivity and availability of capital. So there is a lot of evidence to show that temperature and productivity are connected. So productivity peaks at around 13 C mean temperature and starts to fall and falls significantly as we move beyond 27 C. And the second one is the availability of capital, especially water and arable land, is related to temperatures. So these damage functions took the scenario, what is usually called 8.5 RCP 8.5 C scenario, which means that carbon emissions grow at the pace of the last 20 years. And according to the best understanding of climate science, that means that temperatures will be foreseen higher than pre-industrial averages by 2100. We are already at 1.2 C above pre-industrial levels. So the damage functions, we are using the one which is the most credible one, and there's a lot of work. If you Google it, you can find behind it. It's called the Burke-Siang-McGill damage function. It's a professor at Stanford University. So basically, you take that RCP 8.5 scenario and feed it through that damage function. You can then try to project GDP impacts as a result of physical risk coming from climate change. These are the results of that exercise. Under the RCP 8.5 scenario, Pakistan does not exist by 2100. So the collapse in GDP is around 95% versus baseline. Under the RCP 8.5 scenario, India is 80 or 90% below our baseline GDP as a result of physical risks. Latin America is another one. Brazil is another vulnerable country. China is put at around 40 to 50% below baseline GDP as a result of RCP 8.5 scenario. US is somewhere around 25 to 30% below baseline. So they are quite, probably what's the word, shocking conclusions. And then the kind of shock you're looking at are actually economic models break down. We are used to 4%, 5% away from baselines. Even COVID, for a short period of time, broke a lot of economic models because of the intensity of the shock. But these physical risk profiles, as a result of geography of Pakistan and India, and especially countries who are near the tropics, are very significant. And there are certain assumptions which are made, as I referred to earlier, which makes us think that these projections are actually conservative in their timelines. Firstly, these projections only take into account mean increases in temperatures. So they do not take into account extreme weather events like the one Pakistan is undergoing right now. So what they're saying is that if mean temperature rises, this is the impact on productivity. This is the impact on availability of arable land. So the structural loss of arable land, if forced sea increase happens above pre-industrial level, most of Pakistan is seen as not being able to grow any food or any basic agriculture will be possible. And that's where the GDP impact is coming from. But it, again, as I mentioned, it doesn't take into account any extreme weather events. Which makes us think that these are not conservative models, that they're actually underestimating the impact of climate change. The current understanding of climate change is that most of this physical risk escalates after 2050. So the lines which are drawn are flattish till 2050, and then they start to accelerate after 2050 in terms of the shock. So when we ran these GDP profiles through our capital market assumption machinery, we found very interesting, as you can imagine, very hard-hitting results. So basically, you can't invest in EMs. If you're a long-term investor, no matter whether there is valuation or cyclical effects or something like that, because those countries in some ways don't exist under these scenarios. Another issue with these models is that they don't take into account spillover effects. So there's a SSP5 framework. I don't want to go into jargon, but there's a SSP5 framework, and whereby it assumes certain kind of reaction function of policymakers, governments, public, and so on and so forth to climate change. SSP5 in layman's term is that apathy. Basically, people just talk about it, ask money from other people and do nothing in terms of structural changes, which will need mitigation and adaptation. So that's the SSP5, probably one of the more conservative or pessimistic way. And I would argue that currently we are in that SSP5 vertical. So what we found was that you have to highlight these results. And over the last 2 years, we have shown these results through these papers you see to almost every major investor in the world, covering trillions and trillions of dollars, to highlight to them that, this is one way of scientifically thinking about long-term impact of climate change. Of course, horizons are important here. 10-year horizon results are where a lot of investors are focused on, but some of the more longer-term investors are keenly looking at this analysis and the current understanding of climate change. A lot of these models are also being wired into the stress tests key central banks are now undergoing. And by regulation, these kind of models will become much more mainstream, and understanding of these will grow further as we move forward in time. There's a body called NGFS, which is called the Network of Greening of Financial System. It has put through 6 scenarios of how climate change can pan out. Net zero is one, but of course the RCP 8.5, or what is also called the hothouse world scenario, or a current policy scenario is the one we are focused on, because right now there is no trend in carbon emissions which shows that they are coming down in a meaningful way, which is consistent with net zero. So those are the results. And then, as I mentioned, there are no spillover effects as well in these modeling. And the spillover effects which we are now building in these some of these extreme scenarios, extreme but plausible scenarios, are the impact of immigration and migration. So our thinking is that if, for example, a major population centers collapse because of climate change, whether it's Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or countries in LATAM, what kind of major migration that can trigger for Europe and other parts of the world. So we are trying to map that out from a longer term perspective. You can easily see a 500, 600 million people population transfer if you have a complete collapse of water and food system. So you may say that these are, very extreme results and, doomsday scenarios. But as I mentioned, if you look at the flooding which happened in Pakistan right now with 33%, Pakistan underwater, it has happened at 1.2 C above pre-industrial level. If current policies continue, then the projections are 4 C, minimum 3 C, 4 C to 4.5 C is the median increase. And some of the climate scientists also think about non-linear effects, that you have tipping point effects, that you have increase in volatility, extreme events. So these models, as I mentioned, are not taking into account that, and there's a lot of work happening right now to improve these models to take into account these kind of shocks. So this is just mean increases in temperatures. And then if you look at the heat waves which happened this year in most of Europe, the wildfires which were happening obviously in North America, the IPCC reports which came out was that actually they are underestimating the impact even 1.2 C has on the extremity of climate change. So so this is something to be not only be scared of, but it's actually at a point where we actually have a very non-zero risk that we won't have a country for our future generations, because the whole arable capital system, i.e. availability of food and water, will collapse if obviously temperatures continue to rise. Which brings it to Pakistan and India and Bangladesh's case, because Pakistan, as you know very specifically, does not add too much to carbon emissions globally. Most of the warming which has happened already is because of what developed countries did with their emissions as they industrialized. And right now, the top 4 or 5 emitters, India is the only one, which is a major EM in there. Obviously, China is the largest one, but in terms of proper EM, it's India, and then it's Europe, US, and then Russia. But Russia's emissions are contracting. So we have to think about it from a long-term projection, scenario projection perspective as well. Our own demographics, we are a young population with increase in working age population going forward. So the stress on availability of resources will only increase. And then you can couple it with the fact that, with long history of mankind, is that the first migrations really started as a result of climate change. I mean, otherwise, why would people leave their homes and get to another continent in the first place? So these are significant climate change projections. And what we are seeing right now is it may not happen for another 10, 15 years, but it doesn't mean the severity will lessen. But if you look at and accept what climate science is telling us, what its projections are, then frankly speaking, a lot of the policymakers and government officials in Pakistan should not be sleeping at night, because what these projections show, and in fact, as I mentioned already, there may be an underestimation of the risk, because the kind of flooding which happened in Pakistan isn't supposed to happen until 2050 under the current projections. So I'll pause here. I just wanted to give you this context and the summary of these papers. We are doing a lot of work on it in terms of different scenarios, trying to build spillover effects to develop markets. If, for example, some countries collapse, and then of course, what will be needed in a net zero scenario, what needs to happen for emissions to come down, what kind of technologies, and so on and so forth. But I'll just pause here and hand the floor back to you.
Thank you for that. A very grim situation and very serious condition. Um, People are already writing questions. If you want to write questions, please share them on chat and I'll read it to Dr. Salman. And I'll just kick off with just a short comment, like, as we are seeing, Dr. Salman, that in Pakistan, in the short term, what we have seen from the floods is that there's a real risk that food inflation will spike. And because of that, Pakistan bond yields, which had come down after the announcement regarding IMF's loan, have spiked up again. The rupee has also come under pressure because there's estimated to be around a $10 to $15 billion hit to the economy, especially in the agriculture sector because of the floods. So my question to you is that, as you mentioned that this could lead to mass migration of people, and you mentioned a number of like 500 to 600 million people from emerging markets might be moving to developed markets, developed countries. And even in developed countries, there are things like wildfire. London had extremely hot summer. What do you think are the second round impact of this? And then will it lead to political friction, riots? And because so many people moving could create political disturbances in those countries?
Well, I mean, this is where it becomes, very complicated in the sense like how different countries react to this shock, and of course the severity of this shock itself as well. Pakistan is a military power, nuclear power country, and some of these very populous countries who are most exposed to climate change have become military powers over the last few decades. So we have to consider, climate change-driven frictions and conflicts to become, base cases in some cases. Water already is a problem in Pakistan with India. So when you're talking about big numbers, then a different kind of math can play, right? I mean, in the sense like if you don't have water for like 40 or 50% of your population, then you have to think about what the country's administration will do. And I mean, if there are multiple scenarios you can chart out, but we are at that stage. Although it's a grim situation, I think it's grim because we don't recognize how serious it is. It's not grim. This is not an inevitability that we will get 4C increases. If obviously globally net zero becomes more committed to, you do get switch over to renewable power, decrease in carbon emissions, work on adaptation and mitigation as a result of these climate change effects. It's not a given destiny. This is a projection if nothing is done. So it's grim because that dialogue, that understanding, that conversation, and more importantly, commitment is nowhere to be seen. And in fact, I would argue that Pakistan has to take most of the blame for it, even though they are not the major emitters. And for sure, they have not contributed, and we have not contributed to global warming, which a lot of countries are experiencing. We have at the same time not recognized the problem, not articulated it, and nor led the voices that focuses the mind of key emitters that something has to be done. And it's not just national climate change policies, which is that, UK thinks about itself and reduces its emissions, US thinks about itself, or China is thinking about itself. You need a global solution to a global problem. And that needs recognition, understanding of this problem before people take you seriously. Nobody takes us seriously because we didn't do anything about it after the 2010 floods. We have not thought about long-term climate change policies at all. We are focused on short-term issues, short-term power struggles. But ultimately, the elephant in the room for Pakistan is basically climate change, in that from a 40, 50-year perspective. And I would expect, given if somebody reads those numbers, then Pakistan should become, be at the forefront of that debate. If these projections, which climate science is saying, and it has become more confident on it, and saying your country is vanishing in few decades because of now no fault of yours, because everybody has been emitting, I would think there would be a very different reaction function from Pakistan and being leading that debate and charge, rather than putting the begging bowl out all the time, every time a shock hits. These shocks are going to become predictable. They're going to become more frequent, and that's what climate science tells us. This is the science-based, evidence-based, understanding of it. To your short-term point, yes, it triggers a multitude of things. So you're going to have food inflation. You may have, again, a pressure on the balance of payment as you have to import to rebuild. So the underlying economic strength is not there. This is something we have been discussing for a very long time. Every time a shock happens, Pakistan is on its knees because your underlying strength is not there. And we have not prioritized our underlying strength for decades now. This is not the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. This has been going on for 30, 35 years. You chart the numbers. Pakistan's divergence from India, Bangladesh started 30 years ago. Pakistan had a higher per capita income than both of these countries 30, 35 years ago. Within a generation, we have lost out in absolute sense, in a relative sense. And now we stand at a point where we can't even understand what and agree on collectively from the state's perspective. What are the major challenges, and agree that these are the underlying fundamental principles which need to be followed. So this polarization, this conflict is costly, and it's showing up when shocks hit, and in this case it's flooding.
Dr. Salman, one just last question from my side, and then we'll go for questions from the audience. And a lot of the questions do want to delve deeper into the points which you just mentioned in terms of what Pakistan can do and should do. But before that, I want to ask you this question, that the implication of your research shows that for a lot of asset managers, especially long-term focused asset managers, asset allocators such as endowments and pension funds, Pakistan, as well as some other emerging markets, might just become uninvestable because these guys take a long-term view, and they might think that these countries might just be completely uninvestable. So at a time when we, especially in the startup and VC scene, we are planning for investing in companies which might lead to a big change in the next 10, 20 years, climate change scenario might totally jeopardize all of that. And then not just from a perspective of creating economic headwinds, but also disturbing the balance of payment continuously, so that the exchange rate keeps on depreciating at a rate which was faster than the rate in the past. So when you talk about your report to these kind of investors, do you feel that they have this concern and some markets might become uninvestable even right now?
So on that front, as you can imagine, some of these are very long-term projections. So people obviously take them as the focus has increased, understanding is improving. So before we started off was that we didn't even take this factor as into account in our decision making. So I started in the industry 21 years ago. For most part of the industry, we never took climate change as a factor to consider investments. Now this data projections are coming through. So the work we are doing and other participants in the industry are doing are formalizing how to think about it and formalizing it in a way which becomes relevant to investment decision making. So to your point, we are not taking a view that this means that Pakistan becomes uninvestable. What it means is that we now have the data, the analysis to engage with Pakistan, and not only Pakistan, by the way, India, Bangladesh, other EM countries who are very vulnerable, in a way to highlight that this is what climate science is showing. This is how it's going to, in the long term, start affecting investment decision making. So what are you doing to mitigate and adapt? Because this, as I said, this is a projection. This is not inevitable. It's not inevitable. If you change our behaviors and reaction function right now, a 4C increase scenario can be avoided. But I'm not saying Pakistan or other EM countries are only stakeholders. Yeah, there are multiple stakeholders, especially the DM world. China is a very big stakeholder there. Here, US is a very big stakeholder. Europe is a big stakeholder, although Europe is far advanced of everybody in understanding this and also starting to take action to mitigate climate change, especially the war in Russia and Ukraine will actually accelerate the move towards renewable technologies. And this is another point I want to mention, which is very relevant for Pakistan in a geopolitical context as well. The floods of 2020 happened in a very different geopolitical context. The current geopolitical context in which these floods have happened, even though much more severe, is quite different. Pakistan's relationship with some of the major powers is nowhere near what it was in 2020, and it's showing up in the numbers, which are flowing through in terms of aid and other things which are coming through Pakistan. And this is directly related to the geopolitical context we are in. The second point is that I will highlight is the importance of renewable technologies, not just as a tool to reverse carbon emission, or slow down carbon emissions and then cut them. It's also a very geopolitically secure technology. Let me elaborate it a little bit. When you build wind farms, you can build them on your territory. When you build solar farms, you can build them on your own territory. When you build nuclear, you can build them on your own territory. So your dependence on other countries to provide you fossil fuels reduces a lot. This is one of the major reasons why some of the major powers, especially China, had pivoted to renewables way before everybody else, despite a higher cost curve. So the geopolitical and geostrategic importance of having renewables has increased. And this is something is dawning on Europe now, that why renewables in the long term will be necessary because it shortens the supply chains. So Pakistan has to start thinking about understanding its own energy mix and setup. Although having said that, we are in a region where we have the two largest emitters on our borders, India and China, and both are still growing emissions. Pakistan has to stand up and highlight to these powers in a very significant way that this emissions increase cannot continue because Pakistan pays the cost. This is called a public good versus a public cost, public-private cost issue in economics, but this is happening because of what is happening in that region. So there are multiple factors here, but understanding the dynamics, agreeing that where this is going means that today we can take actions or what is called transition risk and take a transition in the country and through our neighbors who are the biggest emitters in the world to find a pathway that extreme weather event probabilities reduce. This can be dealt in a very scientific, practical and pragmatic way, but you need to have the understanding first and then the willingness and the courage to be able to do that this is necessary to protect the country and leave a country for the future generations, frankly speaking.
Indeed. So let's jump into questions, and a lot of questions, Salman bhai, are exactly on the points which you were just making, that people want to know from you. That I'm just reading the question, that how can Pakistan get out of this shortcut mindset and actually plan, execute, move forward? How can we deal with these issues? How can we incentivize private cooperation to lend support? And lastly, what can the government do to avoid this crisis which you're talking about? So you mentioned a few things, but would love to hear more in terms of what can be some of the practical steps which the government can take or should take, and also what we as private sector should take.
I can share with you from a private sector perspective, right? I think it is the duty of the private sector in Pakistan to understand this area in more detail, put your minds to it, deploy your mindset, understand what the climate scientists are saying. These guys, climate sciences community has no agenda. There are multiple models. It's complex. You can understand the risk behaviors around it. We have been trained. We have been given these tools to think about, complex problems. So put your mind to it. Understand how climate change is, math and science relates to Pakistan. formalize this thinking and then basically lay it to the government and press them that something significant has to be done, and it has to be done now. And the private sector can play a big role because you have the intellectual capacity, intellectual power to analyze complex problems, take risk. And you can start with having a longer term horizons. So in my teams, we work in an area called strategic asset allocation, which is basically looking at returns at 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years. So some of the more larger investors we deal with have that kind of horizon. When you are, for example, investing in a nuclear plant, you need to have a 25, 30-year horizon. So there are investors who are available. And this globally, the capital markets are now moving towards what is called impact investing. So if Pakistan shows the understanding of this issue and draws out a plan that this is how we're going to mitigate and adapt to climate change, then I can tell you capital will flow because our end investors are asking us to invest capital in areas where it will have impact and outcome. But if there is no engagement and the borrower or the recipient of the capital doesn't even show recognition of these risks, it becomes difficult, right, to finance that activity when you don't even understand what it is. So my plea to you is look into this area and all the, irrespective of which sector you are in Pakistan, broaden your horizons and increase your horizons. We are, at least if you agree with climate science, I'm not a climate scientist. I take their findings as a given. I understand how they have come up with these models. I understand their assumptions. You can tweak their assumptions. This is what we are trained to do. But all I can tell you is the confidence of climate science in these projections is increasing. It's not decreasing. The first time I got exposed to this science was in 2014, 2015. And now in 2022, the latest readings of IPCC reports which came through, you can look at the history. All you find is that the confidence bands have reduced, and it's becoming even more pessimistic every time they pull out a projection. So my plea to you is put your minds to it, analyze the problem, raise the awareness of this through media, through the different channels, and do not let it go, because this will require a complete rewiring of the whole economy, and not only Pakistan but also engagement with India and engagement with China on this issue that you are emitting, and these emissions will cause global warming, and Pakistan will pay the price for it. So this is the first steps. I think we should not lose faith in the future, but we can take that if you're walking blind, then the accident becomes inevitable. So our job here is to wake up and then avoid the accident, basically.
Indeed, and very wise. And Salman bhai, I'll request you to also write about Pakistan. Some people are asking, where can we find your report to understand this more deeply? I think the reports are available on Fidelity's website, and I'll try to find the link and try to share it on the chat. But I think Ali Fahad did share it earlier on Pak Launch's channel. But I'll also request you, Dr. Salman, to also mention this impact on Pakistan in your reports or perhaps in an article. Moving to the next question, Saad Siddiqui is asking that Pakistan and other emerging other markets are price takers on global climate change and have very limited resources. Shouldn't the focus be primarily on climate resilience and adaptation rather than attempts to reduce emission or move towards costly sources of energy which won't push the needle on extreme weather events?
I think it's a fair question. I think the solution pathways for countries like Pakistan will look very different from the major emitters who are also rich countries. In the short term, probably that's the area where we only have control, which is make ourselves more climate change resilient. But that said, what India or what China is doing on our borders, what the other major emitters are doing, US, Europe, for example, also has a big impact on global warming. And if you look at the 4C increase scenarios I'm not quite sure what kind of resilience Pakistan will be able to generate if that such a scenario comes into play. Just to give you a number, I was reading that the Indus River's lake, which formed because of this flood, was 100 kilometer or 100 miles wide. I'm not quite sure what kind of resilience would have protected areas with such a big, outflow and pass through of water. Maybe you can leave 10 miles away from the banks. Right now, we don't even do that. People live and build buildings on the river banks. You can probably keep 10 miles, 20 miles, but 100 miles area corridor, if you pass through, if it becomes unlivable, because at one point it will get flooded and so on and so forth. I'm not quite sure that's not a practical outcome, if you see my point, given the extreme weather events we are seeing. But yes, we have to have some build up more resilience. Bangladesh is an example which a lot of commentators raise, that they have really gotten used to living with very high frequency of drastic floods, something we can learn from them. But it's not going to save Pakistan under these scenarios I'm talking about. Ultimately, Pakistan has to engage in a very serious manner to get capital for itself, so that it can become adaptive and resilient, but also play a role in championing the cause to bring emissions down with India and China, for example, because we are paying the price for what they are doing. And then also historical emissions. This debate is a non-starter right now. Why aren't developed markets paying for historical emissions? Why is carbon price still zero for historical emissions? Because if you put a positive price, then it requires transfers to countries who are much more vulnerable. So there are mechanisms to be in place, in the sense like where this damage is coming from, what are the sources of this damage, and again, understanding this issue in the first place will go a long way in shaping Pakistan's narrative, and then secondly strategy, and then execution in terms of protecting the country, right, in the decades ahead.
Thank you. I've shared Dr. Salman's report on the chat of Zoom. So for those who want to read it in detail. Dr. Salman, there's another question linked with the same, kind of like the same thing which you've spoken earlier. He's asking, do you think climate change really is responsible for all of these floods, or is it just our incompetence?
So basically, I think we'll see how the IPCC reports come through. Every time there are some significant weather events, IPCC runs their models and try to link it with climate change dynamics. So, for example, after the first big heat wave came through, IPCC ran these numbers. So they ran the number of probability of having a heat wave in UK with climate change and without climate change. So without climate change, such a heat wave is one in a 200-year event or something. But with climate change, the numbers contract quite a bit, in the sense they become much more likely. So we'll see how these major climate change bodies focus on this area and then come up with. But ultimately, extreme rainfalls, extreme heat waves, wildfires has been a global phenomenon this year. Having flash flooding, we had a massive flash flooding in the UK as well recently. So, and then of course the melting of the glaciers itself in Pakistan, which Pakistan has the second highest number of glaciers after the polar regions, is directly related to climate change. I mean, you already have 1.2 C warming and probably higher in Pakistan, and those river basin which has formed is basically, not designed to take such kind of flow. So yes, I'm not a climate scientist, but I looked at the reports of IPCC when they released after the UK heat waves. I'm pretty sure they will come up with something when they analyze the kind of scope and intensity of flooding in Pakistan, and then try to link with global warming in a more scientific manner. But I'll be surprised that it doesn't happen, because this year we've had many extreme weather events, not just the flooding in Pakistan.
Tim, you're spot on, and that climate change scientists are producing a lot of evidence. I'm just curious that why are there still so many people who are skeptical, as in especially like people like President Trump, like an influential person such as the president of the US. Why are people? What kind of evidence are they looking at to be skeptical of climate change?
I have no idea how former President Trump thinks, but I think as a country who is seeing the impact of extreme weather events, I think we should take it way more seriously than the US.
And when you talk to investors across the world on this topic and on your report, do you find people who are skeptical, or are they now all taking it very seriously?
So it varies. So some of the in Europe, the focus on climate change is very significant, and more we are getting pressure to be authentic and real about it, not just cosmetics. If you see my point, we are being tested that, okay, have you considered the different dimensions of climate change? And as the competition is heating up, they are getting more and more sophisticated analysis, right, on these topics. So certainly for Europe, the capital flow has become more sensitive to climate change. After the war, you will see a lot of focus on climate change come through another dimension, which is called energy security, of course.
Got it. So we have 30.
Yes, both factors will mix up. Yeah.
Just conscious of the time and a lot of questions which are there. So I'll just quickly read through some of the questions. Talha is asking, how much time would some of these afforestation projects would take to bring things back to normal? So can we go back to normal?
Look, going back to normal has to be defined. Firstly, what does that new normal looks like for Pakistan? It could be that we have to deal with, I think, Saad's question, that we have to basically accept that some kind of extreme weather event frequencies have gone up. So the distribution has gone up. We accept it. Rather than calling it that God is angry, we accept that this is a more regular occurrence. Now we need to build resilience to it. I think that's step one. But step two is that we cannot stop here, because Pakistan under 4C, any kind of resilience will not exist. Because if you have, I'm just giving an example again of that 100-mile lake. How are you going to make yourself resilient if the entire basin of Indus expands by 100 miles? If you look at Pakistan geography, right? So we have to have a national dialogue and a plan, multi-dimensional plan against transition risks, resilience, mitigation, adaptation, and also going through with the major emitters, historical and prospective, that they have to pay a global price for carbon, and potentially to people who are the most vulnerable to. I think that's where Pakistan can take the lead and say that we have to protect our country. We are a military power. We need to have a solution, because otherwise Pakistan won't exist. I mean, this is an existential threat.
Indeed, a lot to think about and a lot to fear about, just because I think we all doubt the capacity of the government to deal with even smaller problems. And this, moving to the next question.
As you say, I'm just going to elaborate with this point. I agree with you. Firstly, I mean, having looked at Pakistan's political environment, which has basically become much more basic, in focus on very basic things, and far away from real realities of Pakistan, and we have moved away from real realities in a very significant manner over the last few years. But ultimately, the stakeholders, the ruling elite, which have been in power since independence, have a commitment and a contract with the people of Pakistan. And if that contract is under pressure, it is up to the stakeholders who are not in power in the same way to raise that. Private sector in Pakistan is also a powerful stakeholder. So I ask, proverbially, I mean, figuratively, you as the representative of the private sector, why not focus on this area and chart it out in an intelligent, practical, way, engaging with all with the brain trust which sits globally. I'm not the only one. There are many people who are looking at it and will be more than happy to engage and share their thoughts and lay it out and start that, trigger that media-driven or all the platform-driven debate on these topics, so that it's a two-way process. Ultimately, you're right. The government has to take the lead, but I think the question is, how do you support them? Because ultimately, it's an existential threat for anybody who runs a business or has, it's about our future generations. Full stop.
Indeed. Next question: somebody's asking, RCP 8.5 scenario, 8.5C scenario would cause overshoot earlier than expected. What is estimated error margin? Is it 5 to 10 years?
So the timeline-wise error margins are being revised, and I think, as I said, the current modeling we use really accelerates the physical risk after 2050. But I'm pretty sure that the new iterations will start to accelerate the physical damage earlier by 10 to 15 years. Because as these extreme weather events come through, these timelines are recalibrated. So that's point one. The RCP 8.5's confidence interval around the temperature pathway, and we have got some charts on it, is that minimum increase you're looking at is 3C, median is around 4.5 to 5, and the top end is 6. So even at 3C minimum, you have a problem for Pakistan. I mean, this is what's happening at 1.2C, by the way, what you saw the flood.
Yes. And there are a couple of questions about carbon. Would low carbon technologies create an impact in making climate better? And how can we store carbon across forests, farmland, and wetlands? And if I extend the same question, carbon market is developing in the financial markets. How can Pakistan participate, or how can we even learn about that?
So mostly markets, China is another one country who has started the carbon markets. Europe has been far advanced on it. I mean, US is nowhere there. Different countries are definitely taking a different approach. So US approach is not carbon price based. It's more about subsidizing technologies which are low carbon and focusing on carbon capture technologies as well. Please don't get me wrong. I think the developed market will take the lead on developing these technologies, but China is quite far ahead in renewables. And I think this is something we have to, as Pakistan, connect with China on, that the technology transfer from a long-term perspective needs to be considered here. But again, the geopolitical context, broader geopolitical context matters here. But in terms of carbon prices themselves, I think Pakistan really, and I agree with Saad earlier, should focus on resilience at the moment. Their own emissions, our emissions are not that high. And yes, we have to think about making our land more resilient to extreme weather events, and trees and forests have a very strong role to play, and some specific forests which can reduce soil erosion. I'm not an expert on that, but I'm just sharing with you what I've gathered from my limited knowledge there. But that has to be considered. But this is much of a global problem. Even if Pakistan covers itself with forests head to toe, still Pakistan will collapse because of India and what China are doing.
So then the next question, somebody is asking that, what are the global protocols or methods through which we can put pressure on these countries to take the load for solving this problem?
COP26 promised $100 billion for emerging markets. Pakistan needs to engage with that. And why isn't anybody from Pakistan talking about this? That COP26 commitments on developed markets to emerging markets was $100 billion. They have not given a single cent yet out. What are they waiting for? And secondly, and why is Pakistan, having a view on aid? This we have to raise the point that this is, I think UN Secretary General has started to make those points that today is Pakistan, tomorrow it could be you. Yes, that is true, but ultimately we also have to raise the point that if Pakistan collapses, where will our people go? You see my point? Are other countries ready to take in 100 million people if there's entire collapse of Pakistan's food system and habitat? 33% of Pakistan is underwater, so these are not like small numbers here. You're already talking about these numbers which are very extremely big. And you know, just having military power is not enough. The commitment of stakeholders is to protect the country first and foremost.
No, indeed. And if you just step out of Karachi, go towards, if somebody just steps out of Karachi and drives towards Hyderabad, there's like almost a city of tents outside, and millions of people now living in those tents. So I don't even know whether Karachi is equipped to deal with influx of so many people. So certainly those are big issues. So the last question, and a couple of people have asked this, which is linked with, which is about food security. Somebody's asking that as water table deplete and glaciers melt faster than expected, and with the lack of investment in water recycling and desalination, how can we possibly cope and ensure food securities? What does government and the private sector need to do? And then do you see food becoming a major issue?
It's food and water, which are interconnected, is going to be the most important issue for Pakistan from extreme weather event basis. So the reason why these 95% collapses happen is because of these factors, which you highlighted. Now, the question is, you accept that Pakistan is a very climate change vulnerable country. These extreme weather events will happen more and more. We need to make sure that it doesn't create, second order, very extreme second order, third order effects. I can chart a very grim picture here. If you, for example, 50-60% of Pakistan comes underwater, there's a mass migration from rural to urban areas, because most probably rural areas will be flooded and they don't get food after 15-20 days, and Pakistan has a food shortage. Can you see a civil war breaking out? Of course you can put probabilities to that, right? So these are serious shocks, right, which a country will have to absorb. So yes, private sector has a role to play. Your business won't exist if these extreme weather events cause such mayhem. Agriculture, I saw there was an event on agri-tech. Pakistan's agriculture yields have been stuck at low levels for decades now. I mean, who is going to wake up and say that now Netherlands produces more wheat than Pakistan? Look at their arable land capacity and our arable land capacity. There are multiple things we have not done. We have not adopted the technologies which are available, and the private sector can play a role there. Break up the land, land monopolies, if you will. There's so many monopolies and rent-seeking sectors which have propped up. There are rent-seeking sectors in other countries as well, other EMs as well. But the problem in Pakistan is there are too many. And in every sector, and some geostrategic national interest sector have to have goals which go beyond rent-seeking, which is that, water recycling, as you mentioned, technologies must, food storage must, increase in agriculture yields must. We can solve a lot of these problems with existing technologies, but and then the private sector, external private capital flows. You show a plan. You say that we have to increase our agriculture yield. This is how we're going to do it. The capital will follow. But when there's no plan and there's rent seeking going on, the capital doesn't come in.
Indeed, and I've been in Karachi for the last 5 days, 6 days, and unfortunately, it seems that there is a lot of concern on ground. A lot of investors, especially domestic investors, they are scared of a civil war kind of a scenario because of food crisis and food inflation. And they do say that there's a sharp spike in robberies and theft and snatching in Karachi. And even internally, people are considering, if not moving out of Pakistan, then moving from Karachi to Islamabad, just because it might be safer over there. So those things, unfortunately, are already happening and are perhaps one of the reasons why you see the stock market underperforming and valuations of 2 to 3 times earnings multiple, and still nobody interested in buying those companies, just because they're more interested in buying the dollar and moving out of Pakistan, which is again a very, very grim situation. And it's 10 or 11 o'clock in the night over here in Karachi, and I don't want to end on a negative note, especially on a forum like Spark Launch. So let me ask you the last question for tonight. That technology, what are the examples of technologies which are being used in Europe, or policies around climate change, climate tech, which Pakistan or which our community of Spark Launch can work on? Any lessons from Europe?
So I think, to be fair with you, the switch over to renewables and the cost curve declines which have happened are significant. I respect this community a lot, but energy systems are very capital intensive businesses. So you need a very specific kind of balance sheet and horizon to do that. So where I think the role of technology, organic technology is important is energy, being efficient with energy usage. I think we can be very efficient with energy usage. For example, smart meter technologies are coming through, so you can balance your consumption. You know where the consumption are, energy theft reduction, and then there are areas of how to rebuild from this shock where I think park launch can help. There's a lot of capital which is going to flow. There's a question mark in terms of how the new rebuild should look like, and connecting the recipient of those capital with the donors, I think is some area we can work on. Unfortunately, the technologies I'm focused on are hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of their setup. And again, the energy setup will require that thing. I think our role, I think the most significant role we can play is raise this to our, this debate to a level whereby the state becomes serious about it, because it will have to be state-led. Private sector can do its role, a very important role, but really, you've seen that in Europe, it is state-led. That's why it's so serious. In US, the wavering is because the state is wavers. In China, it is state-led, and the private sector then coalesces around it because of the, the amount of capital in terms of total capital which is needed to do such a switchover. But yes, please, I will just add to your point, this is not an inevitability. Collapse of Pakistan and a scenario where we don't have a country for our future generations is not inevitable. It depends on how we proceed from here, what lessons we take from these big shocks. And if we put them under the carpet as saying that these are act of God and one-off events, and that, frankly speaking, will only make the situation worse. We can't just keep on putting our begging bowl out every time we are hit. Pakistan is one of the most climate vulnerable countries. And this needs to be acknowledged, understood, and then a full-fledged strategy at multiple dimensions on multiple, verticals has to be formulated and then implemented. This is not inevitable. Pakistan's collapse is not inevitable. It's really going to be driven by if we don't do anything about it.
No, thank you for those words that, it's not inevitable. And perhaps, as you rightly pointed out, that we as stakeholders, as investors, as entrepreneurs, as people as businessmen, we need to perhaps collaborate more and to play more, to do more political activism to, I suppose, make the government understand and also take action, perhaps, which is very different from how things have been in the past, where you've tried to stay outside of the government. So
it's a very important point you raise, Alibai, in the sense like this, the role of private sector in terms of activism. So when climate change dimensions are being wired into investment decision making, this is activism by investors. When the recognition of climate change's dimensions are discussed or affecting capital flows, we are doing it for our clients who want us to have a view and then implement solutions in that space. Initially, the private sector's response was the same, that this is government, so we have to do it. We are price takers in that. We have a lot of pressure from our end clients to change, and the industry is changing. So, to your point, you have to, in Pakistan, the private sector has to rethink its role, because some of the issues and challenges facing Pakistan are existential. That's not a pessimistic view. It's a realistic view, but the thing is that if you change our behaviors, then that pessimistic outcome can change. So it's important to talk and think about what will happen if nothing is done. I think that's the way to think about it. It's not pessimistic or optimistic. If we don't change our behaviors, what is the pathway? And I think that's something which the private sector has to put its mind together as well, as much as the government.
Indeed. No, thank you so much for your time and for all of that insights and for making us aware of this critical issue. And I at least can promise you that we at K-Trade will publish a report on this topic in the next couple of weeks. And we'll share that.
Multiple more, Ali bhai, multiple more, not just one.
Yes, and we would love to collaborate with you. And as I said, it would be great if you can also include Pakistan explicitly in your published report. I've read your report, which is excellent, and would be great if we can get you to write something, and so which we can share here with our connections and networks.
Sure, Ali bhai, more than happy to share what our findings are, analysis are in a clear, rational, pragmatic manner, and it's for stakeholders who can make a difference in Pakistan, and we are here to help.
Thank you. And also a suggestion to Park Launch, perhaps they can also publish a white paper with you on this topic. So we are already 6 minutes past our time. Thank you, Dr. Salman, as always, for the insights, and have a nice day. Khud Hafiz.
Khud Hafiz. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.